I'm Gavin, a program manager on the Office for Mac team. In this video series, I'm going to show you how you can use Excel's pivot tables to quickly analyze and summarize large amounts of data. If you want to follow along, you can use the practice workbook that comes with this video. Also, keep in mind that you can pause and resume the video at any time to view it at your own pace. Okay, first, let's take a look at the data we'll be working with. This is a basic table of product transactions. Each record in the list includes a transaction number, the warehouse where it was sold, the date it was sold, and so on. Now, let's say you want to find how many of a specific item, say backpacks, were sold in each warehouse. First, you'd need to filter that data by location. Then, you'd filter by the item you want information on, in this case, backpacks. Then, you add the numbers in the units sold column to get the amount. And then you'd repeat that process for the other warehouse locations. Instead of doing all that, let's reset the filters, and in the next lesson, we'll create a pivot table to get this information a lot quicker. Before you create a pivot table, you need to organize your source data. First, make sure there are no empty columns or empty rows in the data. To remove an empty column or row, hold down Control and then click or right-click on the column or row and then click Delete. Also, make sure that each column heading has a descriptive label. For example, let's change this label to Total Sales. Now, to create your pivot table, click anywhere in the data. Then, on the Data tab, click the arrow next to the Pivot Table button. Here, you have the option to let Excel create the pivot table automatically, or to create one manually. In this video, we'll use the automatic option. This option is quicker, and once the pivot table is created, you can easily customize it to show exactly what you want. Now, click Create Automatic Pivot Table, and Excel creates the pivot table on a new worksheet for you. Keep in mind that you can create multiple pivot tables in a single workbook. Each one that you create will appear in its own worksheet. In the next lesson, we'll look at the pivot table and some of the pivot table tools. This is the pivot table that Excel created that summarized the source data from the other sheet. As long as any cell in the data is selected, the Pivot Table Builder and Pivot Table tab on the ribbon will appear. Click outside the table, and both are hidden. If you click in the pivot table and still don't see the Pivot Table Builder, click this button on the Pivot Table tab. Now, let's take a closer look at the information that the pivot table provides and how it relates to what you see in the Pivot Table Builder. Each field that is selected or checked in the Pivot Table Builder appears in the pivot table. The location field appears here under row labels with one row for each warehouse location, which corresponds to the row labels area on the Pivot Table Builder. The item field appears under column labels with one column for each item, which corresponds to the column labels area. Finally, the values shown in the pivot table are the sums of the wholesale prices. For example, the California location sold $11,642 worth of backpacks. All locations combined sold a grand total of $29,152 worth of backpacks. And you can see the totals for the other items and locations as well. The values area in the Pivot Table Builder indicates that the sum of wholesale is used for the calculations. In the next lesson, we'll use the Pivot Table Builder to summarize the source data in a different way. If the pivot table that Excel creates doesn't show what you're looking for, you can easily change it. For a different look at the existing data, you can drag the fields between different areas. If we drag the item field into the row labels area, now both items and locations appear in rows. To remove a field from the table, just clear the checkbox for the field, or drag it out of the Pivot Table Builder. Earlier, we talked about finding the number of items sold in each location. To do that, you just drag the location field to either the row or column area. Then do the same for the item field. For the values, instead of wholesale, we'll use units sold. And now, at a glance, you can see how many of each item were sold in each location. For example, in California, 82 backpacks, 59 car racks, and so on. The pivot table also shows the total units sold for each type of item, 231 backpacks, etc. In the next lesson, we'll look at another scenario to get the pivot table to show a different summary. Let's say that instead of the number of units sold in each warehouse, you want to determine the average sales for each warehouse on a specific day. First, remove the units sold field from the values area. Then, drag the total sales field to replace it. Now the pivot table shows the total sales in dollars for each location. Since we want to see the average instead of total, we'll need to change the summary function. On the Sum of Total Sales button, click this small icon. And then in the Summarize By box, click Average. The button updates to indicate that the values are now averages instead of sums, and the pivot table now shows the average sales amounts instead of totals. Currently, the pivot table shows average sales amounts for the entire month. To see averages for a particular day, drag the Date field into the Report Filter area. And now, at the top of the pivot table, we have a filter for date, where we can filter the pivot table to show one or more days. Let's just filter to show May 5th. Now we can quickly determine the average sales per item for each warehouse on May 5th. In the next lesson, we'll format the pivot table to make it easier to read and make sure it is updated to include new or changed source data. Although we know that the pivot table values are in dollars, currently they're difficult to read because of all the decimals. Let's format the total sales value to show as currency. In the Pivot Table Builder, click this icon on the Average of Total Sales button. Then click Number. Choose Currency with 2 decimal places. Then click OK, and OK again. Now all of the average sales amounts appear formatted as currency. If any of the values appear as pound signs, just drag the border between the columns to increase the width. Now, let's apply a quick style to the pivot table to give it a different look. Let's go with this one. And finally, if you ever change any of your source data, for instance, say you change the wholesale price of this backpack. Now, back on the Pivot Table tab, click Refresh to make sure that the pivot table reflects the changes in your data. So those are some of the ways that you can use pivot tables to analyze and summarize your data. Pivot tables are a powerful and useful feature of Excel that lets you quickly cut through huge volumes of data to find just what you're interested in. To learn more about pivot tables and data analysis, check out Help and the Office for Mac website for additional videos, tutorials, and content.